She gave him until sundown the next day. 24 hours to clear his family out of a house his great-grandfather built, off land her company had owned on paper for 70 years, so she could scrape the waterfront flat and turn a dying harbor town into a private ore terminal. Helena Frost had bought the whole company, and the company owned the ground the whole town stood on, and so in her mind she already owned the people too, and the last one in her way was a boatwright and widower's son named Wheeze Holloway, who fixed wooden hulls and kept the old lighthouse and didn't, as far as anyone could see, own a thing worth fighting for. So she gave him a day. What she did not know, what her lawyers, for all their money, had never once thought to read, was that a man had made a promise in 1911 to protect exactly these families from exactly this kind of woman, and that the quiet keeper she'd just evicted was the last living person who knew the promise was still good. He didn't leave town. He bought it, the whole town, for $3,840. Wherever you're watching from tonight, stay close. This one comes back around. Helena Frost did not understand why anyone would refuse money to leave a place, and the reason she did not understand it ran all the way down to the floor of her, to a thing she had never once said out loud to another living person. She had never been from anywhere. She had been a foster child, 14 placements before she turned 18, in 3 different states, a new last name to learn how to spell on a new school's roster what felt like every other autumn. She had learned, the way a body learns to flinch, that the worst mistake a person could make was to grow attached to a house, a town, a window with a particular view, a friend who lived close enough to walk to, because all of it was on loan, all of it could be packed into a garbage bag and loaded into a stranger's car on a Sunday afternoon with no warning, and the only thing that had ever truly belonged to Helena Frost was Helena Frost. She had decided, somewhere around the 9th move, that sentiment was a debt you took out against your own heart, and that she would die before she carried that kind of debt. People who loved places were people who had never had a place taken from them in the back of a county sedan. She had. She knew better. She had built an entire life on knowing better. She was 51 now, and she owned things across half the country, and she had never once lived anywhere longer than 3 years, because the moment a place started to feel like home, she could feel the old garbage bag dread rise in her throat, and she would sell and move, and feel the clean relief of being from nowhere again, of owing nothing to any patch of ground. Frost Industrial was the engine of all of it. She bought hard assets, ports, rail spurs, or docks, the unglamorous infrastructure of moving heavy things across a continent, and she ran them better and colder than the families who'd let them go soft, and she had a particular instinct, which she was proud of, for the dying property that everyone else had written off but that sat, by an accident of geography, on top of something valuable. Selkirk, Michigan was exactly that. Selkirk sat on the south shore of Lake Superior, at the back of a deep natural harbor that almost no one in the modern world remembered existed, in the far reach of the upper peninsula where the maps go mostly green and empty. It had been built, town and harbor and all, in 1911 by a single company and a single man, to ship iron ore out of the ranges to the south, and for 50 years it had thrived. A true company town of maybe 4,000 souls with a school and an opera house and an ore dock that ran day and night, and a lighthouse at the harbor mouth whose beam swept the lake every 15 seconds so that no boat captain in the worst November gale would ever be lost in the dark within sight of home. Then the ore played out and the shipping moved to bigger ports, and Selkirk did what such towns do. It shrank slowly for 60 years, down to maybe 600 stubborn people who fished and built boats and ran a diner and a hardware store and refused, generation after generation, to be the ones who finally turned off the lights. The ore dock stood empty and rusting. The lighthouse had been automated, and then defunded, and then 2 years ago formally decommissioned, its great beam gone dark for the first time since 1911. But the harbor was still deep, deep enough for the new generation of bulk carriers. Deep enough, Helena Frost's surveyors had told her, to be worth a very great deal of money to the right industrial buyer, if only the waterfront were clear of the picturesque, worthless, inconvenient town squatting on top of it. So she had done the thing she was good at. She had bought the company. Not the town, you cannot buy a town, exactly, but the old Selkirk Dock and Transit Company, the original 1911 enterprise that had built the place, which had passed through 4 owners over 70 years, and which still, on paper, in deeds nobody had looked at in decades, held title to the ground that most of Selkirk's houses stood on. It had always been a company town in the most literal sense. The company owned the land and the families owned their houses, and lived on the land on long, cheap, automatically renewing leases that everyone had stopped thinking about generations ago, the way you stop thinking about the ground being under your feet. Helena Frost had not stopped thinking about it. Helena Frost had read the deeds, and the deeds said the land was hers. She had a partner lined up, a bulk export operator called Ironwood Terminals, ready to take the cleared waterfront and turn it into a private ore and aggregate port that would never again employ 4,000 people, or 400 or 40, because the new terminals run on automation and a skeleton crew. She had a closing date 90 days out. She had bought 80% of the leases back already, quietly, family by family, the way it is done, a generous check, a relocation allowance, a deadline, the slow understanding spreading through a town that the ground was being sold out from under it, and there was nothing anybody could do because the company had always owned the ground. It said so right there in the deed. And she had one holdout. A boatwright named Wheeze Holloway, who would not take her money, who would not answer her letters, and who happened, though she did not yet grasp the importance of this, to be the man who kept the old lighthouse and its archive, and the son of the man who had kept it before him, and the last living trustee of something everyone else had forgotten existed. She flew into Marquette, and a car drove her the rest of the way up the shore, and she watched Lake Superior open out beside the road, gray and enormous and indifferent, a body of water that has drowned whole ships and entire crews and given the families on its shore 140 years of reasons to keep a light burning, and Helena Frost felt none of it. She felt only the clean, familiar impatience of a woman with a closing in 90 days and one stubborn man between her and the deepest harbor on the South Shore. His name was Wheeze Holloway, and the town thought it had him figured, and the town had only the easy half of him. The easy half was this: Wheeze built and fixed boats. Wooden ones, mostly, the old lake skiffs and fishing boats that the marinas downstate didn't know how to touch anymore, hulls planked in cedar and oak, work that took patience and hands, and a kind of knowledge that was quietly dying out everywhere, but in places too far from the highway to have given it up yet. He worked out of a weathered boat shed at the foot of the point, with the smell of cedar shavings and marine varnish and the lake always in the open door. And he was good in the way of a man who could have charged city prices, and instead charged what a fishing family could pay, because he had decided long ago that the boats mattered more than the margin. He drove an old Ford with rust through the rockers and a tackle box welded into the bed. He made, on Friday nights, a venison and rutabaga pasty from his late father's recipe, folded and crimped by hand, that he brought down to the diner on the harbor because his father had brought them for 40 years before him, and stopping felt like letting another small light go out. The hard half, the half the town half knew and never spoke of, was that Wheeze Holloway was the keeper, not of the boats, of the town. He had inherited it from his father, Arthur, the way Arthur had inherited it from his father before him, going back in an unbroken line to 1911. The Holloways had always been the keepers of Selkirk, keepers of the lighthouse, when there was a light to keep, and keepers of the books, which mattered more and which almost no one understood. Because a company town runs on records, leases and deeds and covenants, and the minutes of meetings nobody remembers attending, and somebody has to keep them, has to read them, has to remember what was promised when and by whom, or the whole structure of a place's life slowly dissolves into the comfortable fog of nobody quite remembering. The Holloways remembered. The Holloways kept the books. It was unpaid and unglamorous, and most of the town thought of it, if they thought of it at all, as old Arthur's harmless hobby, the strange old man up at the dead lighthouse with his ledgers and his logbooks and his century of paper. But it had not always been a hobby, and the older people in Selkirk knew it, even if they had let themselves forget. In the bad years, and a town that shrinks for 60 years has many bad years, it had been a Holloway who knew which family's lease was about to lapse and quietly fixed it before anyone lost a house. A Holloway who could settle a boundary dispute by walking up to the light and coming back down with a 1928 survey. A Holloway who remembered that the strip of common land behind the church had been deeded for the town's use forever and could not be sold no matter how broke the township got. The keeping was the town's memory, and a town without its memory is just a collection of strangers waiting to be cleared, which is exactly what every place Helena Frost had ever bought had become before she got to it. Selkirk had never become that, and the only reason was that one family, for 110 years, had refused to let the books go cold. Arthur had taught Wheeze the creed of it when Wheeze was a boy, up in the lantern room on winter nights with the lake roaring against the point, and Wheeze could still hear it in his father's voice. "We don't own Selkirk," Arthur used to say. "Get that out of your head right now, because it's the thing that ruins keepers. A town isn't owned, it's kept. You keep the light burning and the book straight and the count true, and then you hand the whole of it to whoever comes after you, in better shape than it came to you if you can manage it, and that's the entire job. That's the only job that's ever mattered up here. Anybody can own a thing. It takes a particular kind of stubborn fool to keep one. And then he would look at his son with the level Holloway gaze and say, "You're going to be that fool someday, Wesley. I'm sorry." It's a hard, thankless, unpaid, holy job, and you don't get to refuse it because there's nobody else who will do it right. Weez had not understood as a boy what his father meant by holy. He understood it now. He had understood it the morning he climbed the iron stairs and found the old man gone with the pen still in his hand, and the count, finally, after 83 years, no longer his to keep. Now it was Weez. And Weez, who had spent 3 months barely able to climb the tower for the grief of it, was about to find out exactly how holy and how unpaid the job could get. Arthur Holloway had died 3 months ago. He had been 83, and he had been the keeper for 60 of those years, and he had died the way he'd lived, up in the lantern room of the decommissioned lighthouse with the town logbook open in front of him, a pen in his hand mid-sentence. He had been recording the date the great Fresnel lens was due to be crated and hauled away by the state, an entry he plainly could not bear to finish, because the sentence stopped halfway, the ink trailing off the edge of the word, and that was where his heart had stopped too. Weez had found him there in the morning, in the cold glass room at the top of the tower, with the gray lake stretching out to the horizon, and the logbook open to a sentence that would never have an end. Weez had not finished the sentence. He had tried twice in the months since to take up the pen and complete the entry his father had started, and twice he had not been able to do it, and he had finally left it as it was, the last words his father ever wrote trailing off into white paper, because some things are not yours to finish, and the unfinished line was, in its way, the truest thing in the whole logbook. He had a daughter named Cass. Cass was 11, and she was the sharpest person in Selkirk, a fact she was aware of and only occasionally insufferable about. She had her grandfather's exact temperament, the patience for old paper, the suspicion of anyone who spoke in round numbers, the habit of correcting adults gently and completely, and since Arthur died she had appointed herself, without being asked, Weez's apprentice in the keeping. She read the old leases for fun. She had opinions about the founder's handwriting. And every clear night, she did the thing Arthur had taught her before he died, the thing the family had done for 110 years even after the light went dark. She went up to the lantern room, and she looked out at the harbor mouth where the beam used to sweep, and she counted 15 seconds, the old characteristic interval of the Selkirk light. 1 to 15, the rhythm her family had kept the lake company with since before her great-great-grandfather was born. She counted the dark now, where the light used to be. She said it kept the count from being lost. Weez had never been able to decide whether that broke his heart or mended it, and had concluded, like a true Holloway, that it did both at once. Cass's mother was not in the picture, and that was an old quiet sorrow with no villain in it. Her name was Nora, and she had wanted a larger life than a 600-person town at the end of the world could hold, and Weez had not been able to leave his aging father and the light and the books, and people grow in different directions, and a marriage can end without anyone having committed a crime. Nora lived downstate now. Cass spent stretches of summer with her. It worked more or less the imperfect way real things work. But Cass was a keeper to the bone, and the keeping is not a thing you can do from downstate, and so the deepest part of her had stayed in Selkirk with her father and her grandfather's ledgers and the count of the dark light, and everyone, including her mother, understood that. The ultimatum came on a Thursday afternoon, in the boat shed, with Cass doing her reading on an overturned skiff and the lake bright in the open door. Helena Frost came herself, which her people would have advised against, but she had grown genuinely curious about the one man in Selkirk who would not be moved, and curiosity, in Helena Frost, always won. She walked into the cedar-smelling shed in a coat that had cost more than the boat Weez was planking, and she looked at the hull on the strongbacks and the tools on the wall and the girl on the skiff, and she felt the thing she always felt in such places, which was nothing, or rather a deliberate, practiced nothing, the nothing she had trained herself into at the age of 9 in the back of a county car. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I think you know who I am." "I do," Weez said. He set down the spokeshave. He had a low, unhurried voice, and a stillness to him that Helena, who read rooms for a living, registered as either dullness or depth and could not in the moment tell which. It was depth. She would learn that much too late to spend it. Cass had looked up from the skiff when the expensive coat came through the door, and she had done the thing 11-year-old keepers do, which was to assess. She had taken in the coat, and the car idling outside that cost more than the shed, and the woman's hands which had never held a tool, and she had come to a private conclusion that she would share with her father later that night, and that would turn out to be exactly correct. "She's not mean," Cass would say up in the archive, sorting ledgers. "Grandpa always said watch out for the mean ones, but she's not mean. She's the other thing. She's the lonesome kind. The kind that acts like they don't want anything because they wanted something once and didn't get it." And Wheeze would look at his daughter, who had her grandfather's unsettling gift for reading a person down to the studs, and would file the observation away, and would find at the top of a lighthouse the following evening that an 11-year-old had diagnosed a billionaire more accurately than the woman had ever managed to diagnose herself. For now, Cass simply watched, and Helena Frost registered her the way you register a piece of furniture in a room you intend to clear, present, irrelevant, soon to be elsewhere. It was the last time Helena Frost would ever make the mistake of thinking a child was irrelevant, though she did not know that yet. "Then I'll be brief out of respect for your time." She did not respect his time. It was a phrase, the kind of phrase she'd worn smooth in 11 harbors. "My company owns the land under this shed, under your house, under most of this town. I'm sure you know that everyone in Selkirk knows it. It's why your neighbors have every one of them accepted my offers and made their arrangements. You're the last, Mr. Holloway, and holdouts cost me time, and time is the one thing I can't buy more of, so I've come to end it personally." She set an envelope on the workbench beside a coffee can of bronze screws. "That's a final offer. It's more than fair, it's generous, frankly, for a house on land you don't own. It expires at sundown tomorrow. After that, the lease terminates under its own terms, the company takes possession of its land, and you'll leave with nothing instead of with that. So, 24 hours. Be smart, Mr. Holloway. It's a dead harbor and a dying town. I'm offering you a soft landing out of it. There's no shame in taking it." The shed was quiet, but for the lake, Cass had stopped reading. Weeze looked at the envelope. He did not touch it. "You said the company owns the land," he said. "Did you read all of it, the whole file, or just the deeds?" Helena blinked. It was not a question she had a slot for. "I read what's relevant. The title's clean. My attorneys are very thorough." "I'm sure they're expensive," we said. "That's not always the same thing as thorough." He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his calm that she would only understand much later, not anger, something closer to recognition, the look of a man seeing in a stranger a particular kind of lostness he knew how to name. "Sundown tomorrow," he repeated. "Sundown tomorrow." "All right," we said. "I'll have an answer for you then, up at the lighthouse, if you don't mind. There's something there I think you ought to see before you take possession of anything." He picked the spokeshave back up. "Come at sundown, it's the best time. The light used to come on." And Helena Frost, who had delivered this exact speech in 11 dying places and watched 11 last holdouts fold, felt, for reasons she could not name and did not like, a thin, cold draft of something that was not quite unease as she walked back out into the hard lake light. She told herself it was nothing. The man had folded. They always folded. "I'll have an answer for you," was the sound a holdout makes the moment before he takes the check. She did not know that behind her, in the cedar-smelling shed, the 11-year-old had set down her book and looked at her father, and that Wheeze had not looked back at her because he was looking at the envelope and through it and past it at 110 years of kept books and one unfinished sentence in a logbook at the top of a dark tower. "Cass," he said, "I need to go up to the light tonight. I need to read your grandpa's covenant file, the 1911 one, the Commons Trust, the whole thing, every page, the way he taught us." He finally looked at his daughter, and there was something in his face she had not seen since the morning he came down from the tower 3 months ago and told her grandpa was gone. "I think grandpa left us a door, and I think that woman just walked up and knocked on it without knowing it was there." That night, before he climbed to the archive, Wheeze Holloway sat alone in the dark boat shed for a while with the lake breathing in the open door, and he was honest with himself about what he was about to take up, because his father had taught him that too, that a keeper who acts without weighing the keeping is just a man with old paper and a grudge. Because the covenant was a weapon, and Wheeze had spent 3 months too grief-flattened to climb the tower, and there was a version of this where a tired, angry man used a 110-year-old document to win a fight and to feel, for one sharp, clean moment, like he'd beaten the rich woman who'd called his life worthless in his own shed. He could feel the pull of that. It would have felt good. And it would have been, he understood, a betrayal of the entire thing his father stood for, because the keeping had never once been about beating anyone. Elias Selkirk had not written that covenant to humiliate a future billionaire. He had written it to protect families. The instrument was a shield, not a sword, and the difference between those two things was the difference between a keeper and just another person who happened to hold the deeds. So he made himself a promise, alone in the dark, the kind you say out loud even when no one can hear, because saying it makes it true. He promised he would do this for the families and not for the satisfaction. He would not seize the town for himself, not 1 square foot beyond his own lot. He would put it to the town with its eyes open and let it choose. And whatever came of the woman in the expensive coat, and he already suspected from the practiced nothing on her face that there was more to her than the coat, he would not let himself enjoy her losing because his father's voice was very clear in him on this point. We keep the light so nobody's lost in the dark, Wesley. Everybody, even the ones who came to put it out. Especially them, maybe. They're the ones farthest from shore. Then the promise made, he stood up and climbed to the archive and went to find the door his father had left him. The lighthouse stood at the harbor mouth on a spit of rock the town called the Point, a white tower 110 feet tall with a keeper's house attached, and we's had a key to all of it because the state, in decommissioning the light, had been glad enough to let the local historical society, which was, functionally, the Holloway family, maintain the structure for nothing rather than pay to demolish it. The great Fresnel lens still sat in the lantern room at the top, a faceted glass beehive taller than a man, a second-order lens hand ground in France in 1910 and shipped across an ocean and up a chain of lakes to throw a town's worth of light into the dark. The state meant to crate it and haul it to a museum downstate. That was the sentence Arthur had been writing when he died. We climbed the iron spiral stairs with Cass behind him and a thermos of coffee and his father's reading glasses, which he did not need but carried, and they let themselves into the cold archive room below the lantern, where 110 years of Selkirk lived in oak filing cabinets and bound ledgers and flat map drawers, kept dry and ordered by 6 generations of one stubborn family. "Tell me what you're looking for," Cass said, "and I'll find it faster than you." "The Founder's Trust," we said. "Elias Selkirk, when he sold the company in '54, he didn't sell everything the way people think. Your grandpa told me about it once. I was about your age and I wasn't listening hard enough, which I've regretted ever since. There was a piece he carved out, the land under the houses. He put it somewhere it couldn't be touched. Because here was the thing about Elias Selkirk, the founder, the man the town was named for, the man whose company built it and owned it and could have done with it whatever he liked. He had started as a working man himself, a millwright's son, and he had built a true company town in an era when company towns were mostly instruments of control, places where the company owned your house and your store and your debt, and could put your family on the road for a word said wrong. And Elias Selkirk had seen that, and had hated it, and had built Selkirk differently on purpose. He had let the families own their houses. He had charged almost nothing for the land. And when he grew old and sold the company in 1954, knowing it would pass to men who did not love the place, who would someday do the arithmetic of the deep harbor and the worthless town, he had done one last thing to protect the descendants of the people who had built his fortune. It took Weeze and Cass 4 hours to find all of it, and to read it the way Arthur had taught them to read, which was slowly, every page, looking not for what you hoped to find, but for what was actually there. The work was slow and cold and full of his father. Every drawer Weeze opened was in Arthur's ordering. Every ledger was annotated in Arthur's small, careful hand. The whole archive was, in a sense, the old man's mind preserved in oak and paper, and to search it was to spend the night in his company in a way Weeze had not been able to bear to do in 3 months. At one point around midnight, Cass found a note in the margin of the 1954 trust file, Arthur's handwriting, decades old, a single line he'd written to himself or to whoever came after. "If they ever come for the harbor, the answer is in here. Read it all." And Weeze had to set the file down and walk to the dark window and stand there for a minute with his back to his daughter because his father had known. His father had known this day might come and had left a note in the dark for a son who wasn't listening hard enough at the time and had trusted that the son would grow into a keeper who'd find it. "He left it for us," Cass said quietly behind him. She was 11 and she did not always know what to do with her father's grief, but she knew like a Holloway to name the true thing. He knew somebody would come for it someday, and he made sure we'd have the answer. That's Dad, that's the keeping. That's the whole thing he was always talking about. He kept it for us before we even knew we'd need it. "Yeah," we said, to the window, to the dark, to the lake. "Yeah, he did." He came back to the table. He did not look up at the lantern room above them, where the logbook still lay open to a sentence that stopped halfway because he could not that night, with his father this close in every drawer. He took up the file instead, and he read it all, the way Arthur taught him, every page, and somewhere in the cold hours before dawn, he found the rest of what his father had left him, and the shape of the door came clear. And when they had it all spread out on the long oak table under the cold electric light, with the dark lake outside and the dead lens above them, we sat back, and his hands were not quite steady, and he understood that his father had handed him a key from beyond the grave, and that the woman in the expensive coat had, that very afternoon, turned the lock. The Selkirk Commons Trust, established by deed in 1954, held title to the homestead lots, the residential land under the town, separate from the industrial waterfront. The company did not own that land outright the way Helena Frost's expensive attorneys believed. The company held a reversionary interest, a remainder, the kind of dormant technicality that sleeps in old files for 70 years and that no one bills hours to chase down. And the trust's deed contained a covenant, written in the careful hand of a 1954 lawyer at the instruction of a working man who had become rich and refused to forget where he came from. In the event the company shall cease maritime operations at the port of Selkirk, or shall move to convey, clear, or repurpose the homestead lots, the covenant read, the resident families, their heirs and successors, shall hold the right to repurchase their homestead lots, and the common lands appurtenant thereto, at the original consideration of 1911, said right to be administered by the trustee of the commons. The original consideration of 1911. The few $1,000s the families had nominally paid for their lots when the town was built. A sum fixed in amber for 110 years, against exactly this day. And the trustee of the commons, the person legally empowered to administer the family's buyback right, the office that had passed quietly down one family line for over a century because no one else had ever wanted the unpaid, unglamorous, sacred job of keeping the books, was, by an unbroken chain of succession recorded in the very ledgers on the table, Arthur Holloway. And after Arthur, by the trust's own terms of succession, his heir, Wheeze Holloway. "Dad," Cass said very quietly in the cold room at the top of the dark tower. She had read it over his shoulder because she was a keeper to the bone, and she read fast. "Dad, she's not clearing the waterfront. She's moving to convey the homestead lots. She triggered it. The second she signed that deal with the terminal people, she turned the key, didn't she? Grandpa's right. The families can buy the whole town back for the old price." "For the old price," we said. "How much is the old price?" We turned to the 1911 ledger, the oldest book on the table, bound in cracked leather, the ink gone brown, and he ran his finger down a column his great-grandfather had written, and he found the total original consideration for all the homestead lots in Selkirk, recorded in a careful hand 110 years before, and he read it aloud into the cold air at the top of the lighthouse, and it was the smallest, largest number he had ever spoken. $3,840, we said, for the whole town. Outside, the lake moved against the rocks of the point, the way it had since before there were Holloways to keep its company, and somewhere out in the November dark a freighter's running lights crawled along the horizon, navigating, as ships had for 70 lit years and 2 dark ones, past the mouth of a harbor whose great light had gone out. "Cass," we said, "I'm going to need you to help me, and I'm going to need you to be a Holloway about it, which means careful and fast and no mistakes, because we have until sundown tomorrow and a woman with very expensive lawyers, and she's going to be extremely surprised, and surprised rich people get dangerous. Can you do that?" "I've been reading these books since I was 6, Cass said with the cold dignity of 11. "I can do that. Can I ask one thing first?" "Always." She looked up at the dead Fresnel lens, the great glass beehive that had thrown light into the dark for 70 years and gathered dust for 2. "If we get the town back," Cass said, "do we get the light back too? Is the light part of the town?" Wheeze looked up at the lens. He thought about his father, dead in this room with a pen in his hand and a sentence unfinished. He thought about 110 years of his family counting 15 seconds in the dark. "The light," he said, "is the whole point of the town, Cass. It always was. Yeah, we get the light back too." They worked through the night and into the next day, and it was nothing like the way these things go in the movies, which is to say it was slow and full of phone calls and tedious and terrifying, and conducted mostly on a landline because the cell signal at the point came and went with the weather. Because the covenant was the key, but a key is not a door you've walked through. It is only the promise of one. The buyback right belonged to the resident families, administered by the trustee, and exercising it meant actual work. It meant Wheeze, as trustee, formally noticing the families and the families agreeing, and the funds being gathered, and the instrument being drafted and signed, and above all, recorded with the county before Helena Frost's conveyance to Ironwood Terminals closed and extinguished the whole thing. It was a race to a filing window, and the other runner had a head start and a legal department. Wheeze called the only lawyer he trusted, an old woman named Pauline Reyes who had practiced in Marquette for 40 years and had done Arthur's trust work for the last 20 of them, who answered the phone at 1 in the morning and listened to Wheeze read the covenant aloud and was silent for a long moment, and then said, in the voice of someone who has waited her whole career for one good fight, "Arthur showed me that file once. Years ago, I told him it would never come up. I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong. Read me the succession clause again, Wesley, and then put on coffee, because you and I are not sleeping tonight. And then Wees did the thing that was harder than the law, which was the town. Because the buyback was the family's right, not his alone. He was the trustee, the one who could administer it, but Elias Selkirk had written it to belong to the people. And Wees Holloway was not the kind of man, was constitutionally not the kind of man, to seize a town quietly for himself even to save it. So at 6 in the morning, with the gray light coming up over the lake, he went down to the diner on the harbor, where Marlene Pultz had been making bad coffee and good pasties for 30 years, and he asked her to make some calls. And by 7 the diner was full, the way it had been full the night the Mercer boys' boat went down, and the way it was full at every funeral. The whole stubborn remnant of Selkirk crowded into the booths, frightened and grieving and ashamed. Because they had all already taken Helena Frost's checks and signed her papers and believed, every one of them, that they had been the ones to finally let the town die. We stood at the front by the coffee urns, where his father used to stand to read the Christmas list of who needed help that year, and he told them what the old books kept. He told them about Elias Selkirk, the millwright's son who hated company towns and built a different kind. He told them about the covenant and the reversion and the trigger Helena Frost had pulled without knowing it, and the buyback right that belonged to them, the families, their heirs and successors. He told them the price. He said the number $3,840 for the whole town, and the diner went so quiet you could hear the lake. I'm the trustee, we said, which means I can do this. But Elias Selkirk wrote it to be yours, not mine, and I'm not going to administer it unless this town tells me to, with its eyes open, knowing it means a fight. Because she will fight. She has a closing in 90 days and a partner waiting and more lawyers than we have people in this room. If we do this, she comes at us with everything, and some of us are old, and some of us are tired, and every single one of us already signed her paper once because we were scared. He looked around the booths, at Marlene, at the 4 old men from the marina bench, at the furlong of this town, a retired schoolteacher named Edith Crane who had taught most of the adults in the room, at Ruth and Walt and the rest, the whole inventory of a place that the maps had given up on. So I'm asking, not telling, do we let the harbor go to the ore boats and call it mercy, the way she does? Or do we buy our town back for $3,800 and the worst fight of our lives? It was Edith Crane, 81, who had taught 4th grade for 40 years and had a voice that could still silence a room of grown adults, who stood up first. Wesley Holloway, she said, I taught you to read, I taught your father to read, and in 60 years of teaching in this town I never once read anything as fine as what you just read us out of those old books. She set her coffee down. I signed her paper. I have been ashamed of it for 2 months. I would like, if it's not too late, to unsign it. Put me down for my share of the $3,800, and tell that woman when she comes that the 4th grade said no. And the diner, which had come in frightened, stood up. It was not a movie, and standing up in a diner does not record a deed, and what followed the speeches was the unglamorous human labor that actually saves a town. Signatures and notarizing, and a coffee can pass booth to booth that came back heavy with crumpled bills and 3 checks and one $20 bill from a boy who'd been saving for a fishing reel and would not be talked out of contributing it. Marlene closed the diner and put on more coffee. Edith Crane organized the ascents the way she'd once organized a classroom, ruthless and kind, getting every resident family's signature on the trustee's authorization by working a phone tree she'd kept current for 40 years out of sheer habit. The 4 old men from the marina bench, who between them could barely climb the diner steps, drove the back roads through the night to the houses of the families too old or too far out to come in, and got their marks, because a buyback under a 110-year-old covenant requires the families, and the families were scattered across a township the size of a small county. And up at the lighthouse, Pauline Reyes, who had driven 2 hours up the shore at 2 in the morning with a briefcase and a thermos and the gleam of a lawyer who has finally been handed the case of her life, sat with Wees at the long oak table under the dead lens and drafted the instrument, line by line, against the clock. She made Wees read the covenant aloud to her 3 separate times, listening for the trap, the way a good lawyer listens. She found, around 4 in the morning, the one genuine vulnerability, that the trust's succession of trustees had to be unbroken and documented, or Helena's people could argue Wees had no standing to administer the buyback at all. And the 2 of them spent 90 terrible minutes in the cold archive proving the chain, drawer by drawer, Holloway to Holloway, back to 1911, until they had it, every link, recorded and dated in the family's own ledgers. an unbroken line of stubborn fools who had kept the books so that this exact night could happen. "Arthur," Pauline said softly at one point, holding up a 1962-minute book with Arthur Holloway's young signature in it, accepting the trusteeship from his own father. "He never once got paid for any of this. 40 years I did his trust work, and I never sent a bill he could afford, and he never asked me to. I used to think he was the most impractical man in the Upper Peninsula." She set the book down gently. Turns out he was the only practical one. He was the only man in this town who understood that the bill for keeping a place comes due all at once, decades later on one cold night, and you'd better have done the unglamorous work every single year in between, or you can't pay it. She looked at Wheeze over her glasses. "You can pay it, Wesley. He made sure you could. Sign here." We signed. The chain was unbroken. The instrument was clean. And as the gray light came up over the lake on the morning of the deadline, a town that had come into a diner the night before believing it had killed itself drove through the dark in old trucks gathering the marks of its scattered families. And a boatwright and an old lawyer carried a drafted buyback, and a coffee can full of $3,800 down the iron stairs of a dead lighthouse, toward a county seat 2 hours south, toward a recording window, toward a fight. The recording window at the county seat opened at 8 in the morning, and Pauline Reyes was standing at it when it did, with the buyback instrument drafted, and the trustee's signature, and the family's assents, and a cashier's check for $3,840 made out from a town that had passed a coffee can around the diner and overpaid by $400 because nobody could make change and nobody cared. It did not go smoothly, because nothing real goes smoothly. The clerk had never seen a buyback under a 1954 covenant and had to call the county attorney, who had to read the deed, who had to call the state, and the morning stretched toward noon while a town held its breath 200 miles away. There was a moment around 10 o'clock when word reached Helena Frost's people that something was being recorded against the Selkirk title, and her legal department, suddenly awake, fired off an emergency objection, and for 90 minutes it was genuinely unclear which instrument would prevail, her conveyance to Ironwood, or the town's buyback under Elias Selkirk's 110-year-old promise. Helena Frost spent those 90 minutes in a hotel conference room in Marquette, on a speakerphone, watching the most reliable thing in her life, her certainty, come apart in real time. Her lead attorney, a man who billed more per hour than Wheeze Holloway grossed in a month and had assured her the title was clean, was now explaining, in the careful voice lawyers use when they are about to be very expensive and very wrong, that there appeared to be a reversionary interest and a repurchase covenant predating the company's current ownership by 70 years, that it appeared to have been triggered by the Ironwood conveyance itself, and that, he hated to say it. It appeared the firm had reviewed the deeds without reviewing the underlying trust instruments, because the trust instruments had not been flagged in the data room, because no one in 70 years had thought them worth flagging. "You're telling me," Helena said, in the level voice that her people knew to fear, "that I bought $100 million harbor, and the one thing your firm did not read was a piece of paper that a hardware store town has apparently been reading for 110 years. There was a silence on the line that cost, by Helena's own later calculation, roughly $400. "In essence," the attorney said, "yes." And Helena Frost, who had not lost in 20 years, sat in a Marquette conference room and understood that she was losing, and felt the floor of the thing give way, and did the fast, cold arithmetic of every counter move available to her, the challenges, the appeals, the pressure she could bring to bear on a county clerk in a township of 600 people, the years of litigation she could fund and they could not. She had won uglier fights than this. She knew exactly how to grind a small town into the ground with paper until it gave up. The moves were all right there, and they would probably even work. She looked at them, all laid out in her mind, clean and available. And then, for a reason she could not name, sitting in that conference room, a reason that had something to do with a boatwright's stillness and a girl on a skiff, and the way she had felt nothing on purpose driving up the shore, she did not reach for a single one of them. She told her attorney to stand down. She told him to confirm the recording when it cleared and to take no further action. And she sat in the silence of a room where, for the first time in her life, she had chosen not to make the move that would let her win, and she did not understand why, and the not understanding was the first honest feeling she'd allowed herself in 51 years. It came down to a single question, and the county attorney, a careful man named B.O. Tylettery22D who had grown up 2 towns over and knew exactly what Selkirk was, asked it plainly, which interest came first in time. And the answer, written in brown ink in a cracked leather ledger in 1954, was that the family's repurchase right had been created 70 years before Helena Frost ever heard the name Selkirk, and recorded and never extinguished, and that it sprang into life the instant she moved to convey the homestead lots, which she had done with her own signature the day she signed the ironward deal, weeks before she ever walked into Wes Holloway's boat shed. The covenant did not just predate her. It had been lying in wait for her since before her grandparents were born. At 12:51 in the afternoon, the buyback was recorded. The homestead lots of Selkirk, Michigan, the land under 600 houses, the common lands, the point, and the lighthouse that stood on it, passed back to the resident families, their heirs and successors, administered by the trustee of the commons, for the original 1911 consideration of $3,840. The town had bought itself back, and the man who had made it possible, who held no more of it than his own family's lot, who had done it not for himself, but as the keeper Elias Selkirk had trusted the families to always have, was a widower's son in a boat shed who fixed cedar hulls and counted the dark where a light used to be. He bought the town, for less than the cost of the coat Helena Frost had worn to evict him. She came at sundown, as he'd asked, up the point to the lighthouse, and she came alone, which surprised him, and she came already knowing, which he could see in her face the moment she stepped out of the car, because the news had reached her hours before, and she was not a woman who needed a thing explained twice. Wes was waiting at the base of the tower, with Cass beside him in her coat, and the lake behind them going gold and then pink, and then the deep gray blue of a superior dusk in late autumn. "Mr. Holloway," Helena said. Her voice was level, but it was the levelness of enormous control over enormous feeling, and Wes, who had spent 3 months learning what grief does to a voice, heard the strain under it. "I came for my answer. I gather I already have it. You bought the land out from under me with a covenant my attorneys never found, a covenant from 1954, for $3,000. She looked up at the dark tower and back at him. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I have never lost. I would genuinely like to understand how a man who fixes boats just beat a $100 million terminal deal with a piece of paper older than my parents. So, congratulations, and how?" "I didn't beat you," we said. "A millwright's son named Elias Selkirk beat you in 1954 on behalf of people he'd never meet. I just read what he wrote." He paused. "You want the real answer?" "The real answer is that your lawyers read the deeds and my family read the whole file, for 110 years, every page, because we loved the place and you were buying it. That's the only difference between us, Miss Frost, and it turned out to be the only one that mattered." He gestured up at the tower. "You asked me to give you my answer at the light at sundown because the light used to come on at sundown, and I wanted you to see what you came here to turn into an ore dock. Come up. There's still something you ought to see." And Helena Frost, who had every reason to turn around and reach for her lawyers and her board and her partner and the whole machinery of a woman who does not lose, did not turn around. She followed a boatwright and his daughter up 110 feet of iron spiral stairs into the dark, because some buried, exhausted part of her wanted, against all her training, to see. She had not expected the room at the top. She had expected, she supposed, a dead lighthouse, rust, dust, the carcass of a defunct thing. What she found in the lantern room was the great Fresnel lens, the faceted glass beehive taller than a man, catching the last of the sundown through the windows and throwing it back in 1,000 small fires, and below it on a long oak table 110 years of a town's kept books, and an open logbook with a sentence in it that stopped halfway across the page. "My father died in this room," we said. 3 months ago, up here with the lake out there, writing in that book. That's his last entry. He was recording the date the state means to come and take this lens away to a museum downstate, crate it up, haul it off, because a dead light is just expensive glass to people who keep the kind of books your lawyers keep. We's looked at the unfinished line. He couldn't finish the sentence. "I've tried twice. I can't either, so it just stops there. The last thing the last keeper before me ever wrote, trailing off because he couldn't make himself write down the date they'd take the light." Helena looked at the logbook for a long moment. She was not a woman given to looking at things for long moments. She did it anyway. "Why does any of it matter?" she said finally, and it did not come out cruel. It came out lost, almost desperate, the question of a person whose entire map of the world had just been proven wrong. "It's a dead light. It's a dying town. The harbor's worth $100 million to the right buyer, and the town's worth $3,800 to itself. By every measure I have ever used in my life, you are all standing in a place that does not make sense to keep, and you fought me for it with a coffee can. So explain it to me, Mr. Holloway, because I have spent 51 years being absolutely certain that people like you are sentimental fools, and I am standing in your dead lighthouse for some reason I cannot explain, and I would like, for once, to understand." Wes Holloway looked at her for a long moment. And then, because he had spent 3 months learning to read what loss does to a person, he said the thing he had begun to suspect since the afternoon she walked into his shed and felt, by her own evident effort, nothing. "Where are you from?" he asked. Helena Frost went very still. It was a question no one had asked her in decades, not "where do you live," which she could answer with a list of 9 states, but "where are you from," the older question, the one that assumes a person has a single place that made them. She had built a whole life so that the question would have no purchase on her, and here it was, asked plainly by a boatwright in a dead lighthouse, and she found she had no smooth answer, no deflection, none of the practiced moves. The question had walked straight past 20 years of armor and put its hand on the thing underneath. "That's not a relevant question," she tried, and heard how thin it came out. "It's the only relevant question," we said. "It's the question under every other question in this whole business. You came here to clear a town because you genuinely don't understand why people won't leave one, and a person only fails to understand that for one reason." He held her eyes, not unkindly. "Where are you from, Miss Frost?" "You felt nothing when you drove up the shore," we said quietly. "I'd bet on it. Most people feel something the first time they see this lake. It's the biggest fresh water in the world. It's got its own weather. It's drowned more men than I can count. People feel it. You felt the closing date. And you stood in my shed and looked at my daughter and my work, and you made yourself feel nothing on purpose, like a person who learned a long time ago that feeling something about a place is how you get hurt." He paused. "I don't think you've ever been from anywhere, Miss Frost. I think that's the whole thing. I think you buy places and sell places, and you have never once in your life belonged to one. And I think you cannot understand why 600 people would fight a billionaire for a dying harbor, because you have never had a single square foot of ground that would notice if you were gone." The lens caught the last red of the sun and held it. Helena Frost did not say anything for a long time. When she did, her voice had changed entirely, the control gone out of it, and underneath the control something very young. 14, she said. 14 houses before I was 18, 3 states. I learned to spell new last names. I learned not to unpack. She was not looking at Wheeze. She was looking at the lens, at the 1,000 small fires going out as the sun dropped. I learned that the worst thing you can do is love a window with a particular view, because on a Sunday a stranger puts your things in a bag and you never see the window again. So I decided I'd never owe my heart to any patch of ground as long as I lived. And I have kept that promise for 51 years. I own things in 9 states, and I have never lived anywhere long enough to, her voice caught. Long enough for anyone to notice if I were gone. I made sure of it. I thought that was strength. I built an entire life out of being from nowhere, and I called it freedom. And I have spent 20 years going into places exactly like this one and clearing them out. And I never once asked myself why a person who claims not to believe in home would spend her whole life destroying other people's. The lantern room was silent, except for the small sounds an old building makes settling into a cold night. We did not rush to fill it. He had learned in 3 months of grief that the worst thing you can do when someone finally sets down a weight they've carried for 50 years is to reach for it too quickly, to fix it, to talk. So he let her stand in it. He let the confession be as large in the room as it actually was, which was very large because Helena Frost had just said out loud, to a stranger in a dead lighthouse, the sentence that organized her entire life, the one she had never once let herself hear in her own voice, long enough for anyone to notice if I were gone, and a thing said out loud for the first time after 50 years needs room to exist before anyone touches it. "Because it's an argument," we said gently. "You've been having it for 51 years, with every town that ever loaded you into the back of a car. You go in and you prove that places don't matter, that they can be cleared and sold and forgotten, that nobody should ever have loved them, because if places don't matter, then the windows you lost didn't matter, and the kid in the back of the car didn't lose anything that was real." He shook his head slowly. "But you can't win it, Miss Frost. You could scrape every dying town on this lake flat and you would never win it, because the argument was never with the towns. It was with how much it hurt to be a child who was never from anywhere. And no amount of proving places don't matter will ever make that stop hurting. The only thing that's ever made it stop for anybody is the exact thing you've spent your life running from, which is staying, long enough to be missed." Helena Frost put her hand over her mouth. It was a small gesture and an enormous one, and Cass, 11 and a keeper to the bone, watched it with the grave attention she gave the old ledgers, and understood, the way children understand, that something was being unlocked in this room that had been locked for a very long time. And she did the thing her family did, the only thing they had ever really known how to do for the lost. She stepped to the window and she looked out at the harbor mouth where the dark was coming down over the water, and she began quietly to count. 1, 2, 3. The old 15-second rhythm of the Selkirk light kept in the dark by a child the way her family had kept it for 110 years so that the count would not be lost. "What is she doing?" Helena whispered from behind her hand. "Counting the light," we said. "There's no light. There hasn't been for 2 years. We count it anyway." So the rhythm's still here for whenever it comes back on. He looked at the billionaire who had come to clear his town and was standing in his father's lighthouse with her hand over her mouth. "That's the answer to your question, Miss Frost. That's why it matters. Because somebody has to keep the count in the dark so that nobody coming home across the water is ever lost and alone, even when the light's out. My family has done it for 110 years. You spent 51 years being a ship in the dark with no light and nobody counting for you." His voice was not unkind. It was the opposite. "It's not too late to come into the harbor. That's the thing nobody told you in the back of those cars. The light comes back on. You just have to stop running long enough to let somebody keep the count for you." She did not leave that night. She came down the iron stairs behind Wheeze and Cass, and she stood on the point in the full dark with the lake breathing against the rocks. And she did a thing she had not done in 51 years, which was to not know what came next, and to be willing to stand in the not knowing instead of buying her way out of it. The Ironwood deal could not happen now. The homestead lots were gone, bought back, recorded, and without the residential waterfront the terminal had nowhere to put its rail and its stockpiles. And the deep harbor that had been worth $100 million to the right buyer was worth nothing at all to a buyer who could not reach it across a town that, now ironclad, owned its own ground. Helena Frost had lost the deal. She had by every measure she had ever used lost, the first loss of her career, clean and total and recorded at 12:51 in the afternoon at a county seat she'd never heard of. The strange thing, the thing she turned over for a long time afterward, was the third feeling underneath the shock and the cold fury, the feeling she did not recognize at first because she had not felt it since before the county cars. It was relief. Some buried, exhausted part of Helena Frost was relieved to have finally, after 51 years, run her whole hard life into a wall she could not knock down. As if she had been waiting, without knowing it, for somebody, somewhere, to build a thing strong enough to stop her, so that she could finally, at last, stop. The board meeting she dialed into that week was the hardest professional conversation of her career, and she made it from the corner booth of Marlene's diner, with terrible coffee going cold in front of her, because she could not bring herself to make it from a hotel 40 miles away from the town she had spent 90 days planning to erase and one night learning to see. She told her partners the truth, more or less, that the Ironwood conveyance was dead, that the harbor could not be reached across land the town now owned in perpetuity, and that she was recommending the company abandon the terminal strategy entirely. There was shouting. There were 2 partners who used the word unrecognizable about her, which she found, sitting in that booth, that she did not mind being called. And there was a longer, stranger conversation, weeks later, in which Helena Frost said a sentence to a board she had never said to anyone in 20 years. That she had been wrong, not about this deal, but about the whole shape of what she'd been doing with hard assets and dying towns for 2 decades, and that she was not willing to do the next one the old way. Some partners walked. Most, to her genuine surprise, did not, because the numbers on a harbor brought back to life turned out to be less ruinous than the numbers on a harbor fought over for a decade in court, and because Helena Frost had spent 20 years building exactly enough trust that, when she said "I have been wrong," the people who knew her best understood the cost of it and leaned in. She still owned the old company, the rusting ore dock, the industrial waterfront, the worthless deepwater harbor with nowhere to go. And she sat with that in the diner, over Marlene's genuinely terrible coffee, the next morning, while the town watched her sideways and didn't know what to make of a billionaire eating a pasty in the corner booth where she had no business being. And somewhere over the second cup, she stopped doing the arithmetic of the harbor and started, for the first time in her life, doing a different kind of math. The kind a person does when they are wondering not what a place is worth but what it could be, and whether they might be allowed to be part of it. What she built, over the years that followed, took a long time and is still being built, which is the point of it. She did not rebuild the ore dock into a terminal. She turned the company, the same hard asset instinct, pointed for the first time in her life at building up instead of clearing out, toward the one thing the deep harbor was actually good for in the modern world, which was not ore but boats. A working harbor for the commercial fishing fleet that had nowhere safe to winter for 200 miles. A marine repair operation that gave Wheeze Holloway more wooden hulls than he could handle and the apprentices to handle them. A small shipyard that brought, slowly, the impossible thing back to a dying town, which is young families who came instead of left. She was good at it. She turned out to be, when pointed at building, the best harbor builder on the lake, because she had spent 20 years learning exactly how these places died and could, it turned out, run the whole thing backward. The strangest part for Helena was how much she liked the work once it pointed the other way. She had assumed building up would feel slower and softer, and somehow lesser than clearing out, that the clean, decisive thrill she'd chased for 20 years lived only in the demolition, in the nerve it took to end a thing. She had been wrong about that, the way she had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. There was a deeper and more durable satisfaction in the harder direction, in the engineering of a winter harbor that would keep a fleet safe, in coaxing a dead shipyard back to life slip by slip, in the slow accumulation of a place coming back around you instead of falling silent. Anyone with enough money and enough nerve could knock a thing flat. It took a real builder to bring one back, and Helena Frost discovered at 51 that underneath the woman who cleared towns there had always been a builder who'd simply never been pointed the right way by anyone who knew how. We taught her the other literacy, not finance, where she could run circles around him, but the keeping. He taught her to walk into a place and ask not what it cost or what it could become, but what it had been, and who had loved it, and what it was still quietly trying to be. He let her read the books. And one cold afternoon, he took her up to the lantern room and showed her the logbook with the unfinished sentence, and told her the whole of it. His father dead in this room with a pen in his hand. The line that stopped halfway. The 2 times we had tried to finish it and couldn't. And Helena Frost, who had spent 51 years making sure she would never grieve a place or a person enough to be undone by losing them, stood in the cold glass room and understood, finally, what it had cost this quiet man to keep the count for a town while carrying that, and understood what she had been trying to buy her way out of feeling her entire life. "You never finished it," she said, looking at the trailing ink. "No," we said. "Some things aren't yours to finish. He started that sentence. It's his. I just leave it open." He looked at her. "You spend your whole life closing things, deals, towns, the door of a county car. Maybe the thing you never learned is how to leave one open on purpose, how to stand in the not finished and let it just be." Helena Frost looked at the unfinished line for a long time. She did not say anything, but something in her that had been clenched since the 9th Foster placement let go by one full turn, and she let a thing be unfinished and did not try to close it, and discovered that the world did not end. But the first thing she did, before the shipyard, before any of it, was the light. She paid to relight the lighthouse. She fought the state for the Fresnel lens, the great glass beehive they meant to crate and haul away. And she won because Helena Frost did not often lose twice, and she had it restored in place. And the night they relit the Selkirk light for the first time in 2 years, the whole town came out to the point in the cold to watch, and the beam swept out over the harbor mouth at the old characteristic interval, 1 to 15, and Cass Holloway stood at the rail and counted out loud. The way her family had counted in the dark, except that this time there was a light to count, and her voice broke on the number 8, and her father put his arm around her. And Helena Frost stood a little apart from the crowd, the way a person stands who is not yet sure they are allowed to belong, and watched the light she had paid for sweep across 600 faces that would, for the rest of their lives, set their watches by it. We stood near the base of the tower with his hand on the cold stone and watched the beam go out over the water, and the only thing that kept him from coming apart entirely was Cass's voice at the rail counting the rhythm aloud, because the one person who should have been there for this was not Arthur, who had kept the light dark in his books for 2 years like an open wound, who had died with the sentence about its taking unfinished, who would have given anything he owned to see the great lens throw its fire over the harbor mouth one more time. We thought, "You should be here for this, Dad." And then he thought, the way grief teaches you to think if you let it, you are. This is you. Every bit of this is you. Because the light was on for one reason and one reason only, that a family had kept the count in the dark for 110 years and refused to let the rhythm be lost, so that when the moment came that someone could light it again, the town still remembered exactly how. Arthur had not lived to see it relit, but Arthur was the reason it could be. The keeping had worked. The bill had come due on one cold night, and the family had been able to pay it because the old man had done the unglamorous, holy, unpaid work every single year of his long life. Marlene from the diner was crying. The 4 old men from the marina bench stood in a row with their hats off. Edith Crane, who had taught half of them to read, mouthed the count along with Cass, 1 to 15, the way you mouth the words of a hymn you've known your whole life. and the beam swept out over Lake Superior, the biggest cold water in the world, the water that had drowned ships and crews and given a shoreline 140 years of reasons to keep a light burning. And for the first time in 2 years, no captain coming home across that water in the dark would be lost and alone within sight of the harbor mouth. "You can come stand with us," Cass said to her, without turning around. The 11-year-old had appointed herself, somewhere in those weeks, the keeper of Helena Frost the way her grandfather would have. "You don't have to stand all the way over there. The light's for everybody. That's the whole point of a light." And Helena Frost, who had been standing all the way over there her entire life, came and stood with them. It was Cass, in the end, who said the thing that no one else would say, the way it is so often a child who simply states the obvious sentence the adults have all been carefully walking around. Helena had taken to coming up to the lighthouse archive on quiet afternoons, to learn the books, she said, the leases and the deeds and the 110 years of a kept town, because she had discovered, to her own astonishment, that she loved it. That there was a deeper and more durable thing in keeping a place than in clearing one. That the records she had once read only for the title were Read the Holloway Way, the entire memory of a community, the names of everyone who had ever been from somewhere. She was learning to be from somewhere. She was terrible at it at first, the way a person is terrible at a language they should have learned as a child, and she got better slowly, and Wheeze was a patient teacher in the unhurried way he did everything, and Cass corrected them both, gently and completely, the way only an 11-year-old can. "You're not from here, though," Cass said to her one afternoon, point blank, looking up from a 1923 ledger. "Not really. You weren't born here. Your family's not in these books." Helena, who had negotiated against governments, found herself, as she so often did now, completely unhorsed by this child. "No," she admitted, "I'm not. I wasn't born anywhere, really. I moved around too much for it to count." Cass considered this with the gravity of a small trustee. "My grandpa said being from somewhere isn't about being born there," she said. "He said it's about whether you'd stay even when it'd be smarter to leave. He said anybody can be from a place that's easy. You're only really from a place once you've had a reason to leave it and you stayed anyway." She looked at Helena with her grandfather's exact level gaze. "You could have sold the harbor and left. Walt said you'd be gone by Christmas. You stayed. You relit the light." She shrugged, 11 years old and wiser than every advisor Helena had ever paid. "I think that means you're from here now. You just got here late. That's allowed. Grandpa got here in 1939 and he was 8 and everybody said he was a Selkirk man by the time he died, so." The cold archive room was very quiet. The great lens caught the afternoon light above them and threw it back in 1,000 small fires. "You really think that's allowed?" Helena Frost said, and her voice did the thing it had learned to do in this town, which was to go honest. "Getting here late." "It's the only way anybody ever gets anywhere," Cass said, which was either a child's accident or the truest thing anyone had said to Helena Frost in 51 years. And Helena, looking at her, could not tell which, and decided, like a true Holloway, that it was probably both at once. That night Helena drove back to the small house she'd bought near the point. Not her only house then, though it would become so, and she stood at the window that faced the harbor, and she watched the lighthouse beam come around, 1 to 15, the rhythm she was learning to count without thinking, and she did not feel the old garbage bag dread rise in her throat for the first time in 51 years. She had been waiting her whole life for that dread to come, the signal to sell and move and be from nowhere again. It did not come. She stood at a window with a particular view in a town that now, by an unbroken chain of kept books, knew her name, and she let herself love the view, and she waited for the punishment that 50 years had taught her always followed loving a window, and there was no punishment, only the light coming around again, and again keeping the count for her, the way somebody had finally agreed to do. If you go to Selkirk now, and people do now, which is its own quiet miracle on a shore the maps gave up on, you will find a town that did not die. You will find a working harbor with a fishing fleet that winters safe, and a small shipyard, and a boat shed at the foot of the point where a man planks cedar hulls and sells, on Friday nights, a venison and rutabaga pasty from his late father's recipe at the diner where Marlene still makes the coffee terrible out of pure principle. You will find young families who came instead of left. You will find a retired 4th-grade teacher named Edith Crane who tells anyone who will listen about the morning the 4th grade said no to a billionaire. And you will find, at the harbor mouth, on a spit of rock the town calls the Point, a lighthouse that was dead for 2 years and is not dead anymore, throwing its beam out over the cold water every 15 seconds, 1 to 15, the way it has since 1911 minus the 2 dark years that nobody likes to talk about, so that no captain in the worst November gale is ever lost and alone within sight of home. Helena Frost kept a house in Selkirk. Not her only house at first, and then after a while her only house, because she had discovered late what she had spent 51 years making sure she would never have to feel, which is the specific terror and relief of having a patch of ground that would notice if she were gone. She is in the books now. Pauline Reyes drew up the papers that made her a resident, and Wees recorded them in the ledger in his own hand, and Cass checked his spelling. And somewhere in the oak filing cabinets at the top of the lighthouse, there is now a line that says Helena Frost came to Selkirk late and stayed. There is a logbook in the lantern room with a sentence in it that stops halfway across the page, the last words Arthur Holloway ever wrote, recording the date the state meant to take the light away, a sentence he could not bring himself to finish, that his son could not bring himself to finish either. It is still unfinished. Wees has decided it always will be. The state never took the lens. Helena Frost saw to that. So the sentence Arthur could not bear to write turned out in the end to be a sentence that never needed to be true. But Wees leaves it open anyway, trailing off into white paper, because some things are not yours to finish, and because an unfinished line in its way is its own kind of light left on, a place held open in the dark for whatever comes next. If you ask Wees Holloway what it all meant, and people ask, because some softened, bent version of the story got out, the way these stories do, the Boatwright David and the Billionaire Goliath, the town bought back for $3,800. He will think about the easy answers and the true but partial ones, and the version the headlines told, which missed the whole of it. And he will tell you what he tells everyone, which is that he did not buy the town. A millwright's son named Elias Selkirk bought it in 1954 for the families he would never meet, and Arthur Holloway kept it safe in a logbook for 60 years, and all Wees did was read what they wrote and keep the count in the dark long enough for the light to come back on. He will tell you that the keeping was never about owning anything, that a town is not a thing you own. It is a thing you keep, the way you keep a light and keep the books and keep the count, and then hand all of it carefully to whoever comes next. And he will tell you that the most important thing he ever did was not the deed recorded at 12:51 in the afternoon, though that was the part the headlines liked. It was teaching a lost woman who had never been from anywhere how to stand at the rail in the cold and count the light, 1 to 15, the old rhythm, the family's rhythm, so that she would know for the rest of her life that she had finally come into the harbor and that somebody at last was keeping the count for her too.